Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of the Teaching with Magic podcast. My name is Elise Trudel-Cedeno, and I'm your host, writer, researcher, and editor. I've been a classroom teacher for 7 years. I started as a high school English teacher, and then I transitioned to becoming a middle school literacy educator, and I've also worked in early childhood literacy as well. For the past few years, I've been working with Signum University and their Signum Academy program, specifically for kids in grades 3 through 12, as a book club facilitator. I work with my students in monthly book clubs where we discuss fantasy literature, historical fiction, and other fictional topics. And I've also worked on Outschool.com as a literacy tutor, a book club facilitator, and I've worked with children of varying degrees of reading difficulties, strengths, and abilities. I'm so happy that you're here and that you're taking the time to listen. I hope this show is everything you've been looking for. And with that in mind, I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce the Teaching with Magic project and the topics that we'll explore together. Are you a teacher? Are you a teacher who loves literature? Are you a teacher who loves Star Wars, who loves science fiction, who loves the Marvel movies or DC Comics? Then this is the podcast for you. Teaching with Magic explores fantasy literature, pop culture, literacy, and teaching. For the past few years, I've been writing entries on my observations on how fantasy literature and pedagogical practices interact. And now I'm taking my blog to you in audio format. I've been researching how fictional teachers make magic in the classroom by observing their practices and making connections between what's on the fictional page and what real-life teachers see in their own classrooms. I've also written commentary on current teaching practices, pedagogical theories, and keeping up to date with current research on literacy and education. First and foremost, I'm a teacher. I love working with children and getting them to their aha moment. But I'm also an academic. I enjoy reading literature, writing papers about literature, and I enjoy learning more about how the brain processes reading and reading skills. But these ideas, these academic spheres, if you will, rarely come together. Am I a literature person who writes about pedagogy? Or am I an educator who writes about literature? My blog and my podcast are an attempt to merge these two worlds together. I wrote a paper back in 2018 for a graduate course on Harry Potter at Signum University. At that time, I was getting a second master's degree. My first was in English education. This one was in language and literature. So you can see how my thinking was that these two ideas are very disparate. But as I was studying Harry Potter, I was interested in how the teachers at Hogwarts showed their skills not only as witches and wizards, but at their core as teachers. How did they get their students invested in their lessons? How is quote-unquote good teaching evaluated at Hogwarts? One of my opening sentences was, I wonder what a professional development session at Hogwarts would look like. As it turns out, I'm not the only one. Mbalia Thomas, Andrea Bixler, Renee Dickinson, they've all used the Harry Potter novels as a way to analyze teaching practices and have written on the benefits of using these novels as mentor texts for their own practices as teachers. These researchers gave me the inspiration to continue with this research, and that perhaps my interests are not so disparate after all. Throughout this podcast, you'll hear me talk about some of our favorite fantasy authors, stories, and characters. I do this in several ways. I take a look at specific characters in books, films, and TV shows, and I analyze their teaching methods based on what is presented in the story and research-based strategies in education. In my blog, I call these teacher features. I draw evidence and make observations about the characters' actions and how they present new materials to their students. I think of them as model teachers from the fantasy world. What can we learn from, say, Albus Dumbledore or Master Yoda about how they teach? And how can we bring some of their best practices into our own classrooms? What do these characters teach us? Not only about teaching content, but about making lasting human connections with our students. Some of these teacher features will have their own episodes, or I'll combine several teacher features into one episode. At times, I talk about my own teaching and the strategies that I use in my own classrooms. But I also want to take the opportunity to talk to other teachers and how they approach fantasy and science fiction. I have a lot of friends in the Tolkien ACOFAN world, and I work with a lot of people in the Harry Potter studies world as well. But there are so many wonderful stories to explore that it can't possibly stop there. While I may begin by talking about and talking to teachers who are interested in Tolkien, Harry Potter, and Star Wars, I'm always looking for more books to read and people to talk to. I have a segment in my blog called Teachers with Magic, in which I interview real-world teachers about their content and use of fantasy in their teaching practices. I'll be interviewing some of these teachers in several episodes, and I'll be talking to plenty of others about various topics in fantasy and in education. If I may digress a little, I want to share some personal anecdotes that brought me to this moment. How did I get here to creating this podcast? Why are these subjects so important to me? And why, oh why should you, oh listener, invest your time in this podcast? Well, I hope I can offer some clarity to these questions. And hopefully, you'll understand why I've come to this moment. After graduating from Teachers College of Columbia University with a master's degree in English education, my teaching career had a frustrating beginning. But, as many stories do, it does get better. I spent my first 3 years bouncing from school to school, first as a high school English language arts teacher, and then as a middle school literacy teacher. What was most frustrating about this constant shift was that I never got my foot in the door. I had to start from scratch every year, get to know new students and a new school culture every year for 3 years in a row, only to be told that, for whatever reason, I wasn't going to be receiving a new contract for the next year. When you work in a profession that expects you to have a solid plan for an entire year in advance, quite frankly, it felt impossible. Add to that the pressure of trying to be a New York City teacher, one who had to know everything, had to be everything, everywhere, all at once, and one who understood that every aspect of the lesson, classroom, etc., had to be perfect all the time. After 3 years, it became too much. I felt burnt out, defeated, and worst of all, a failure. I felt that I had failed every single one of my students every year because I wasn't a good enough teacher. So I took some time to myself. I got married. I enjoyed my honeymoon. And then and only then did I begin to look for work again. I wasn't going to waste another summer panicking about finding a job on time, especially if it was going to be another job that would run me ragged all over again. I found a job as an early childhood literacy enrichment teacher, and it was there that I began to find my niche. I got to teach in small groups. I learned more about the foundations of reading and the English language, and I got to work with the cutest toddlers I had ever met. I learned that my previous approaches to teaching reading and ELA weren't working for a reason. It wasn't because I was an inexperienced or a terrible teacher. It was because I had been taught how to teach the content incorrectly. and that I had approached it from the wrong direction. Because I had wanted to teach secondary English, I thought, okay, that's where I'll start. That's what I'll teach. But I knew nothing about the foundations of the English language, and I didn't know how to help my students who couldn't read. Not that they didn't want to read, but they couldn't read. I couldn't help any of my middle or high school students when I didn't understand the basics of teaching decoding. I could give my struggling readers all of the graphic organizers and KWL charts in the world, but I had no clue how to help a 7th grader who couldn't decode a text. So I took some courses, and I'm continuing to learn more about being a reading specialist. And this includes relearning how I teach reading. For the past 20 years or so, American education has been approaching teaching reading with the whole language movement. Give enough kids exposure to good books, and they'll be motivated to learn to read. Admittedly, I'm paraphrasing quite a bit, but the gist of it is give students enough motivation, teach them strategies that will help them, look like they're learning to read, and they'll be able to get it eventually. But what many educators already knew, and what current educators do understand, is that approach only works for some students. It certainly doesn't work for kids with dyslexia, and it doesn't teach kids how to decode. These were some of the strategies that I was teaching my students in the middle school. I figured, okay, they already know grammar. They already know how to build a sentence. So these are the strategies that will work for them. Strategies like look for context clues, or make a prediction based on what's in the text, or build an inference based on your background knowledge and what's in the story. But that wasn't the case. I had students who could not decode a sentence. They could read it out loud, but they couldn't tell me what they had just read. Approaching the science of reading led me to understand that English has roots. Teaching reading needs to be done in an explicit, systematic, and purposeful manner. Some of my previous posts in Teaching with Magic do reflect this idea of the whole language movement, where if you just give kids a comfortable reading chair, give them the proper motivation, that will work. That will be perfect. And in some cases, that is still true. But we can't begin there. And if my students are struggling to decode, whether they're 6 years old or in 6th grade, I have to go back to the beginning. I have to teach them how phonics, phonemic awareness, phonological awareness, all of those systems and codes work before I teach them to love to read a text. How am I going to teach them to love Tolkien if they can't read any of his sentences? And so, I understand now that by understanding linguistics, explicit instruction, and understanding how our brains learn to read will not only dramatically improve my teaching, but it will improve how my students read. When I was at Signum University, I took a course in Anglo-Saxon. You may or may not know this, but another word for Anglo-Saxon is Old English. Studying Anglo-Saxon might seem like an odd venture, but hear me out. It actually revealed a bit more about our English language than I ever thought possible. English is composed of Germanic roots, Latin roots, and Greek roots. I had some awareness of the Greek and Latin roots, but I didn't know anything about Anglo-Saxon. I began to see that as I learned this language and I started reading Beowulf in the original Anglo-Saxon, I started to see these connections between how we read today, how the English language works today, and that I needed to learn some more. If I hadn't taken that break, if I hadn't gone to Signum University, and if I hadn't taken those extra classes to become a reading specialist, I don't think I'd be ready to go back to the classroom today. And I don't think I'd be recording this podcast. If you're a teacher and you like to teach fantasy and science fiction, if you're a language teacher and you like to work on grammar, conjugations, if you're a teacher who's familiar with the science of reading and how that connects to how we approach reading, teach language, if you're a history teacher or a science teacher or any other type of content teacher, and you like to use fantasy literature to bridge the gap between the theoretical, the scientific, the abstract, and the concrete, I'd love to hear from you. How do you bring magic into your classroom? How do you use magic to engage your students with your content? Please feel free to reach out to me at any time. Listeners, thank you for being here with me today. I hope you've enjoyed this introduction, and I hope to see you again soon. You can follow us on all of the major social media sites such as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You're also welcome to support us on Patreon. Like us, give us a review, subscribe on your favorite podcast feed, and in the meantime, keep making magic.